Eleanor Whitmore woke before dawn, as she always did, to the sound of rain tapping against the thin roof of her family's cottage. She lay still for a moment, listening, before the memory of the previous night came rushing back to her like cold water. 2 men in fine coats had come to their door. They had not shouted. They had not threatened. They had simply stated, in calm and terrible voices, that her father owed the Duke of Ashbourne a sum of money so large that Eleanor could not even picture it in her mind. £300. It was a number that meant nothing, and everything at once. She rose quietly so as not to wake her younger brother, Samuel, who slept in the corner near the hearth, and made her way to the small kitchen where her father sat exactly where she had left him hours before. Thomas Whitmore had not moved. His hands were folded on the table, and his eyes were fixed on nothing in particular. He looked, Eleanor thought, like a man who had already accepted his fate. "Father," she said softly, "you must eat something." He did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "I never meant for it to grow so large, Eleanor. A game here, a game there. I always believed I would win it back." Eleanor had heard this confession before, in pieces, over the past several months, but never with such honesty. Her father had always been a man of small comforts and modest dreams, a wool merchant who provided well enough for his family until her mother's death 3 years ago. After that, something in him had quietly broken. He began visiting the card tables at the manor with men far wealthier and far more practiced than himself, perhaps searching for distraction, perhaps searching for something else entirely. Eleanor did not know, and she suspected he did not fully know either. "What will happen to us?" she asked, though she already feared the answer. "If I cannot pay the Duke, I will be taken to debtor's prison," he said plainly, "and you and your brother will be left with nothing. The cottage will be seized along with everything in it." The words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, but she did not allow herself to cry. Crying would solve nothing. She needed to think. That night, she barely slept. She turned the problem over in her mind again and again, searching for any solution, however small. They had no relatives wealthy enough to help. They had no possessions of real value to sell. The wool business itself had been struggling for years, barely providing enough to keep food on the table. There seemed to be no way forward. It was near morning when an idea came to her, sudden and frightening in its simplicity. She had heard from the village baker's wife that the Duke himself would be traveling through the area within the week, inspecting his tenant farms and properties before returning to London. If she could not change her father's debt, perhaps she could change the terms of how it would be paid. She did not tell her father what she planned. She knew he would forbid it, out of pride if nothing else. Instead, on the morning the Duke's carriage was expected to pass near the Eastern Road, Eleanor dressed in her cleanest dress, tied back her hair, and walked the 3 miles to the manor gates alone. The gatekeeper looked at her with open suspicion when she arrived, her boots covered in dust from the road. "The Duke does not receive visitors without appointment," he told her, not unkindly, but firmly. "Please," Eleanor said, standing her ground despite her racing heart. "I only ask for a few minutes of his time. It concerns a debt owed to him. I believe I may have a solution that benefits us both." The gatekeeper hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to such a direct request from someone so plainly dressed. After a long pause, he disappeared through the gate, leaving Eleanor standing in the cold morning air for what felt like an eternity. When he returned, his expression had softened slightly. "You may wait in the front hall. The Duke is finishing his correspondence, but he has agreed to see you briefly." Eleanor's hands trembled as she followed him inside. The manor was grander than anything she had ever seen, with high ceilings and polished floors that reflected the morning light. She felt entirely out of place, a merchant's daughter standing in a house built for nobility. But she reminded herself why she had come, and she straightened her shoulders. When she was finally led into a study lined with books, she saw him for the first time. Duke Reginald Ashbourne was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with a serious face and sharp, observant eyes. He did not rise when she entered, but he did set down his pen and regard her with curiosity. "You are the daughter of Thomas Whitmore," he said. It was not a question. "I am, Your Grace. And you have come to beg for leniency on his behalf, I assume." Eleanor felt a flash of something close to anger at his tone, though she kept her voice steady. "No, Your Grace. I have not come to beg. I have come to offer something in exchange for more time, or a different arrangement, so that my father's debt might be settled without destroying our family entirely." This seemed to genuinely surprise him. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "And what exactly do you propose to offer? Your father has no land of value, no goods worth the sum he owes. What could his daughter possibly bring to such a negotiation?" Eleanor had asked herself this same question 100 times on the walk to the manor, and still she was not entirely certain of her answer. But she spoke anyway, choosing her words carefully. "Myself, Your Grace, my labor, my time, whatever skills I possess. I can read and write well. I have kept accounts for my father's business since I was 12 years old. I am not afraid of work. If you would allow me to work in service to the debt, in whatever capacity you find useful, I will not stop until it is repaid in full." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor forced herself not to look away, though every instinct told her to lower her eyes in the presence of a man so far above her station. There was something in his gaze that she could not quite read, something between skepticism and reluctant interest. "You understand," he said slowly, "that what you propose could easily be misunderstood. A young, unmarried woman, entering service in a nobleman's household, with no family to oversee the arrangement, is not without risk to her own reputation. I have considered that, Your Grace. But I have also considered the alternative, which is watching my father taken from his home and my family left with nothing. I would rather risk gossip than risk that." Something shifted in his expression then, though Eleanor could not name it. He was quiet for a long moment, tapping his fingers lightly against the edge of his desk. "I will not place you in common service," he said finally. "It would indeed invite the very gossip you claim not to fear, and frankly, I have no need of another maid. However, my estate accounts have been poorly managed since my previous steward's departure. I require someone capable of organizing correspondence and reviewing ledgers, someone with a sharp mind and steady hand. If you are as capable as you claim, you may take on that role. Your wages will go directly toward your father's debt until it is settled." Eleanor could hardly believe what she was hearing. It was far more than she had dared hope for. "Thank you, Your Grace. I will not disappoint you." "See that you don't," he said, though there was the faintest hint of something almost like amusement in his voice. "You may begin tomorrow morning." Eleanor left the manor that day, feeling as though she were walking on air, though the long walk home gave her time to consider the weight of what she had just agreed to. She would need to tell her father, who would surely object, and she would need to prepare herself for a world entirely unfamiliar to her. When she returned home and explained what she had done, her father was indeed furious, pacing the small kitchen with his hands clenched. "You cannot simply walk into a duke's manor and offer yourself into his service, Eleanor. What were you thinking? What will people say?" "They will say what they wish regardless," Eleanor replied calmly. "But father, this is the only way. You know it as well as I do. There is no other path forward." In the end, Thomas Whitmore had no real argument against her logic, only his wounded pride, and eventually he relented, though he made her promise to return home each evening rather than stay within the manor walls overnight. The first weeks at the manor were difficult, in ways Eleanor had not anticipated. The household staff regarded her with open suspicion, certain that she had somehow schemed her way into a position of unusual favor. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Pratt, made little effort to hide her disapproval, while the other servants whispered behind her back whenever she passed. The work itself, however, suited her well. She found the estate's ledgers in a state of genuine disorder, with missing entries and miscalculations scattered throughout years of records. She threw herself into the task with focus, staying late into the afternoon each day to untangle the mess left behind by the previous steward. The Duke, for his part, kept his distance at first, reviewing her work only occasionally and offering little in the way of conversation. But as the weeks passed, he began to take more notice of the careful, methodical way she approached each problem, and the brief reports she left for him grew more detailed, more insightful than he had expected from anyone in his employ. One afternoon, several weeks into her work, a sudden storm rolled in while Eleanor was still reviewing a particularly tangled set of accounts in the study. The rain came down so hard and so fast that the roads home became impassable, and she found herself unexpectedly stranded at the manor as evening approached. The Duke found her still working by candlelight when he came to check on the household's preparations for the storm. "You should have left hours ago," he said, though not unkindly. "Surely you do not intend to walk home in this weather." "I was hoping it might pass," Eleanor admitted. "But it seems I am stuck here for the evening." He considered this for a moment, before gesturing for her to follow him to the sitting room, where a fire had been lit against the chill. "You may as well wait it out in comfort, rather than catching a cold over your ledgers." It was the first time they had spoken outside the formal boundaries of their working arrangement, and Eleanor found herself unexpectedly at ease in his company. They spoke of small things at first, the weather, the state of the roads, before the conversation gradually turned to more personal matters. The Duke spoke, with surprising candor, of the isolation that came with his title, of a marriage years ago that had ended badly and left him wary of trusting easily. Eleanor, in turn, spoke of her mother's death and the quiet grief that had settled over her father in the years since. By the time the storm passed and a carriage was arranged to take her home, something had shifted between them, subtle but unmistakable. Neither spoke of it directly, but in the weeks that followed, their conversations grew more frequent, their exchanges less formal. The Duke began seeking her opinion on matters beyond the household accounts, and Eleanor found herself looking forward to their conversations in a way she had not expected. Months passed in this manner, the debt slowly shrinking with each set of wages applied against it, though Eleanor rarely thought of the arrangement in such transactional terms anymore. She had come to genuinely respect the man behind the title, a man burdened by responsibilities he had never asked for, who carried himself with more humility than his position required. It was nearly a year after her first visit to the manor, when Eleanor discovered, quite by accident, that the remainder of her father's debt had been quietly settled months earlier. She found the record while reviewing an old ledger entry, the final payment marked complete, far sooner than her wages alone could have accounted for. Confused and somewhat unsettled, she brought the matter directly to the Duke. "This entry," she said, placing the ledger before him on his desk. "It shows the debt was cleared in full several months ago, but my wages could not possibly have covered such a sum in that time." He did not deny it, though he seemed almost reluctant to explain himself. "I cleared the remainder myself," he admitted finally. "It seemed an unnecessary burden to continue once I understood the full circumstances of how the debt had accumulated in the first place. Your father's mistakes were his own, but you should not have had to carry the weight of them indefinitely." Eleanor felt a rush of emotions she could not entirely name, gratitude tangled with something closer to indignation. "You should have told me. I have been working these months believing I was still repaying a debt that no longer existed. Would you have continued, had you known otherwise? He asked, his eyes meeting hers directly. Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, then paused, genuinely considering the question for the first time. The truth, she realized, was far more complicated than she had expected. She no longer came to the manor each day out of obligation alone. She came because she had grown to care for the work, and more than that, she had grown to care for the man who had quietly lifted a burden from her family, without expectation of recognition. I believe, she said slowly, that I would have continued regardless. It was, perhaps, the closest either of them had come to acknowledging what had grown between them over the past year, something neither had set out to find, but neither was willing to abandon now that it existed. The Duke rose from his desk and crossed the room to where she stood, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. Eleanor, he said, her name unadorned by title for the first time. I did not anticipate any of this when you first stood in my study and offered yourself in service to your father's debt. I expected, at most, a capable clerk to manage my accounts. I did not expect to find someone whose company I have come to value above nearly everything else in this household. Eleanor felt her heart racing, though she kept her voice steady. Nor did I expect to find myself caring for the opinion of a man I once feared would destroy my family. He smiled then, a rare and genuine smile that softened the seriousness usually present in his features. Then perhaps it is time we considered what comes next, not as Duke and debtor's daughter, but simply as two people who have found something unexpected in each other. When Eleanor finally returned home that evening, to tell her father what had transpired, she found him waiting at the table, much as he had been on that first terrible night, nearly a year before. But everything else had changed. The debt was gone. Her family's home was secure, and she returned not as a daughter desperately seeking to save her family, but as a woman who had built something entirely her own, something neither she nor anyone else could have predicted when she first walked through the manor gates with nothing but desperation and quiet determination to guide her. Her father listened to her story in silence, and when she finished, he reached across the table and took her hand. Your mother would have been proud of you, Eleanor. Prouder than I have ever been of myself. Eleanor smiled, feeling for the first time in a year that the weight she had carried since that rainy night had finally, truly, lifted.